Looks like this.
Well, welcome to another of our Fresh Expression conversations, and it's really good to be joined by Jonas Kurlberg, Katherine Schmid, and Rey Crizaldo over in the Philippines. Actually, this is a across the globe type of conversation we've got here. Catherine's in New York, Jonas and I are in the UK, and as I say, Rey's in the Philippines. So this conversation has come about as a result of the book Missio Dei in a Digital Age, which Jonas wrote the introduction for, and Rey and Katherine have both written chapters in, and look forward to talking about that. And this is actually the first of three conversations with people who have contributed to the book, and discussions about what the mission of God looks like in this digital age. And great to see Eleanor signing in and putting a comment to say where she's from. If you are joining us, and it's great, we've already got 20 people watching, do let us know in the comments whether you're on Facebook or on YouTube. You're more than welcome, and let us know that you're there. And as Jonas and then Katherine and Rey share with us, then any questions that come up, do put those in. We want you to be part of this conversation as well. So looking forward to interacting over the next hour or so. So let me introduce Jonas, who's going to sort of open the theme for us. And Jonas is Programme Director of the MA in Digital Theology at Spurgeon's College. He's also a Deputy Director of the Centre for Digital Theology at Durham University, and the convener of the Global Network for Digital Theology. He's also the author, as well as writing in this book that we're talking about, the author of Christian Modernism in an Age of Totalitarianism, T.S. Eliot, Karl Mannheim, and The Moot, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2019. Jonas, you're very welcome. I'm going to hand straight over to you to introduce this thing to us, and then I'll come back when you're done, and we'll hear from Katherine and Rey and enter into a conversation. But it's great to see people joining us from USA and from across the UK and beyond. Brilliant. Over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, Simon, for that introduction. And thank you to Lizzie and Tim as well at Fresh Expressions for initiating these webinars. And I really look forward to the conversations that will take place over the next few weeks. So in April 2019, the Centre for Digital Theology gathered a group of theologians, church practitioners, and computer scientists for a 24-hour symposium in Durham. And we felt that missions in a digital age was an understudied topic, and something that was important for the churches to grapple with. And there are a number of great explorations of the use of technology in mission evangelism, but we wanted to push this conversation a bit further. So a fundamental assumption behind the book is that digital technology and digital technologies are not neutral tools that merely we can use to different ends. That is not to deny that they are tools and they can be used differently, but it's to affirm that tools have social implications. Digital technology shape the conversations that we have, how we relate to one another, and fundamentally alters cultures. So we wanted to go beyond the practical questions of how do we use this technology effectively, although those questions are important, to think about the implications of the use of digital technology in missions, and more broadly, how we should and can be thinking missiologically in a digital age. Do the concepts that we have inherited from mission studies over the last century or so, do they still hold? Can we just outrightly adopt them? Or do we need to amend them or even abandon them altogether? So for me, this started a thought process, which I'm merely hinting at in the introduction that I wrote. It's not really the done thing to be too expansive about your own arguments in the introduction. So this is my attempt to flesh them out a little bit, although I'm still hesitant I'm going a bit back and forth in my own thinking. So one of the questions that I started to think about is whether contextualization is a helpful way of approaching the missiological task of making the gospel known in the digital age. Contextualization as a term is used both descriptively and normatively. It describes the reality that theology is inevitably shaped by historical and cultural context. All theology is contextual. But then there's also the normative or missional task of translation. Contextualization in this sense is the intentional act of translating the gospel into new cultural contexts so that it can be heard and understood on local terms or within specific contexts. Applying this missional logic to the digital age would require the contextualization of the gospel into digital culture. However, I have some hesitancy regarding whether there is a digital culture. To begin with, digital technologies are different and therefore have different social cultural impact. Technology as cultural force is therefore not monolithic. Artificial intelligence is very different from social media platforms. And even Facebook is very different from TikTok, and they lead to different social practices. Further, how we use technology is partly already to some degree determined by a wider cultural lens to begin with. So digital communication technology such as social media might even have a fragmenting effect upon the creation and sustaining of cultures. And we see kind of fragmentation into myriads of subcultures online. The question then is, which digital culture should the gospel be translated or contextualized into? It becomes an endless task. Yet clearly, digital technology is a cultural force that is changing all aspects of human existence. Despite the fragmentation I mentioned above, there are some universal characteristics and processes of digitalization, such as the suspension of the importance of geographical location, so where you are in the world matters less, and the datification of the world, in which the world is translated into a digital mirror of binary codes. So we need to reflect deeply on the implications of these and other aspects of digitality. So it's not that I want to abandon contextualization or enculturation as missiological terms. After all, they tell us that faith is a lived reality, and we need to make sense of our faith in the context we find ourselves in. However, I suggest there are other concepts and ideas that are helpful. For example, I would like to suggest the metaphor of the network. Using the image of the network for theological reflection is not original. Other theologians have used this idea. But I think it might give us a framework to think missiologically in a digital age. The network is arguably a defining characteristic of digitality. The internet, after all, is a network connecting different nodes to enable information flows. In missional terms, the network speaks of relationality, reciprocity, and mutuality, in which there is a giving and receiving between different bodies. It still allows for particularity, for each node in the network retain their own identity. However, missions under a network logic means that we are also changed in the encounter with the religious and cultural other. It demands a greater level of self-reflection, both as individuals and communities. Further, a networked missiology emphasizes missions as a grassroots movement. A network is organic and tends towards the non-hierarchical. And this idea is reflected on in a couple of the chapters in the book, the Missio Dei book, such as Steve Hollinghurst's chapter on digital evangelism. We'll be hearing from him next week. And Erkki Suutinen's chapter on creating digital designs for grassroots missions. But I think it's here that mission in a digital age is the most powerful, through individuals sharing their lives and stories on social media platforms. Only the other day, I was skim reading the latest book by Steve Bruce, who's a sociologist of religion. Now, Bruce is a staunch defender of the secularization thesis, and he insists that the processes of secularizations are both inevitable and irreversible. Christians are increasingly marginalized. And in a secular society, ordinary people simply don't encounter religion in their everyday life, he argues. However, it's interesting that he also notes that social media is one space where such bumping into religion actually happens. And he further argues that social media allows for the kind of intimacy that is conducive for religious conversions. And just an anecdotal example of this, a couple of years ago, I met a professor here at Durham University. She's a professor in literature, clearly not a person of faith. I told her that I was researching theology and digital technology, and she kind of felt that it made sense. And she said, you know, I regularly encounter religious ideas on social media, and it kind of makes me think I should go to church. So just an interesting example. So in the end, I'm left with the thought that perhaps it's the road to Emmaus, the image of journeying together, that is the paradigmatic image for mission in a digital age.
Brilliant, thank you, Jonas, for that introduction to this conversation. And as people have been listening to you, if they've joined us from the Fresh Expression movement, there'll be a number of things that resonate there for us. The importance of contextualization, of contextual mission, which is so at the heart of what Fresh Expressions is all about, and the ability to contextualize what we do for that digital space. I'm going to invite Katherine now to join us, and actually I'm going to bring in Ray as well, so all four of us are on the screen. But Katherine, let me just introduce you first. You're assistant, you can put me right if I've got this wrong, assistant professor at theology at Molloy College, New York, and you've written on the intersection of theology and digital culture in the book Virtual Communion, which was published last year. Maybe that's just the latest of your books, but
no, that's the one.
That's the one, but which was published last year. But yeah, I mean, some of your sort of initial reactions to what Jonas has said and this whole theme of Missio Dei in this digital age.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting us here to let us talk about this volume that we're all so excited about. Thank you to Jonas for editing it along with Pete. Hi, Pete. I know you're there as well. So a couple of things. So I thought what we could do is just, I won't kind of, outline my chapter or anything. I'll leave that to the reading. But I wanted to say a couple of things about what Jonas has posed. So I think all of us, one of the things that comes up for me every time we're able to talk is just trying to figure out exactly how best to understand technology, how best to understand digital platforms. And it's a question that we keep coming back to. And maybe for some of us, it's frustrating because we want to kind of get that out of the way and then start talking, maybe more like sort of theologically or something. But I do think that it is something we come back to because it's evolving. Has an interesting relationship to the rest of the things that we might consider cultural paradigms. So I have tended in my own work to think about it as a culture and to lean, I think, more heavily on the category of enculturation. And some of that probably is because of my confessional position, which is Roman Catholic. And so, to be quite honest with you, I am not really, I very rarely think about or talk about missiology, really. So this was a kind of an exciting opportunity for me to do that. And I kind of fell back on my training and thinking about enculturation specifically from the perspective of John Paul II, not uncritically, by the way. And I think that we can have a good conversation with Ray about some of the post-colonial issues with thinking about enculturation. But what I like about it is that, because I do approach it from, I would say, more of a systematic theology position, I kind of want to think more doctrinally about things, and that's kind of my starting place. Enculturation offers for me what I would call sort of incarnational missiology. So, Jonas and I were saying recently that we kind of end up in the same place many times, but maybe we sort of get there differently. And for me, what enculturation is able to do, and I can say more about maybe like the specifics of what that looks like, is that it really does get to this idea of relationality. And I think this is what social media particularly offers us, that mass media in some ways was able to facilitate somewhat, but I think that one of the issues I'm seeing within my own tradition, but I think just largely, I think it's a temptation within all Christian traditions, is to understand digital platforms with the paradigm of mass media. And what that does is that it focuses too much on what I would call content production and not enough on relationality, which is really where Jonas ended his comments, right? I mentioned the road to Emmaus in my own chapter as well, because I do think that is truly the right paradigm for thinking about mission, not focusing on so much, broadcast, which is kind of ironic, I guess, since we are broadcasting, but maybe not so much just the broadcast, but also entering into meaningful, to the extent that it's possible, meaningful relationships with people on digital platforms. And I do think that's possible. It might be difficult to sustain. It might be rare, but it is possible. And I think that it is something, maybe Jonas's metaphor of the network, kind of connecting nodes is really helpful there in terms of recognizing dignity of each individual, and then how they are connected not only to one another, but to all sorts of other folks, and how they connect to each other. So maybe that's kind of where I'll stop for now. I mean, I'm happy to kind of go into more of what I think in terms of enculturation, but that larger question of how best do we understand technology, that's going to really infuse all of our conversations, especially when it comes to mission, and I think most of us are on board with saying that it's not merely a tool, but then the second part of that conversation is kind of where we're left, and maybe what we could say a little bit more about today.
Yeah, thank you, Katherine. And Ray is having difficulty with his internet, so he's coming in and out. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Ray has said based on his chapter in the book, and the sort of the liberation theology context, and also what it means for democratizing theology across the globe, which I'm hoping Ray will be able to join us at some point. But this whole conversation is pertinent for us in this sort of pandemic season, because a number of people are inhabiting, if you want to use that language, the digital space that weren't doing that before, in terms of churches, in terms of how we're connecting as communities, worshiping communities, or churches or congregations. A number of people have moved into the online space, but that people are doing that in different ways. Some of them are doing it relationally, and others perhaps are using the digital platforms as tools. I mean, I don't know if you've got any sort of thoughts on the specific here and now. Some people may be joining us thinking, I need some theology to help me think through what we're doing as a fresh expression, as a church, in terms of how we're using the digital space. I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right that the pandemic threw a lot of people into the conversation against their will, maybe. And I do think that what's exciting about it is that it is helping people confront the questions that we have that those of us in the global network have been, interested in and for a long time, which is, what do we mean by community, for example? What kind of expectations do we have for, I would say, sort of the non-virtual church community, the parish, the congregation, and how are we actually living that out in ways? What are the stories we're telling ourselves about how we're living it out, or how are we actually living it out? I think a lot of, I don't want to speak for, I don't want to speak too generally, but I would suspect that a lot of communities probably found gaps in their relationality when they had to go online, right? So once you no longer have that built-in weekly in the flesh meeting, in what ways are the rest of their week, are there Wednesday, Thursday, relationships that are happening? It seems to me that that's kind of part of what the pandemic did. And there's a way in which you can kind of think to yourself, okay, well, once the pandemic is over, we'll get back to the real stuff. But I've been encouraged because I think that, and maybe it's just the conversations that I'm in, with online, and maybe that's just a biased sample, but I think it really will change the way that people understand the relationship between their digital platforms and the rest of their sort of, what they were doing 20 or 30 years ago or whatever. So I don't know if Jonas has any thoughts about that, but that's a couple things that come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, Christians have been online for as long as the internet has existed. And we tend to forget that. Sometimes the institutional church have been less slow to adapt certain aspects of digital technology, but even so, most churches before the pandemic had websites, for example. Right? So what's gone online in some ways is that aspect of worship. But I think it's telling, some of the participants here might have heard Nona Jones, who's the head of Facebook's Faith and Community team. She spoke a few years back at Premier's digital conference, saying that the reason why Facebook set up her particular team was that they realized that the largest and most active interest groups out of all the groups out of all categories of groups on Facebook were the religious ones. So, there's this kind of I don't know, maybe myth is too strong, but the idea that churches have just discovered online is slightly skewed. But what's happened en masse is kind of, how do we now do worship online? That's been the main question. But in that process, maybe discovered many different ways of using digital technology and pushing it further than they've done before.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And just some really good comments coming in online. Pete Phillips has pointed out that Premier, who you mentioned, Jonas, have been doing some webinars on digital engagement and agreeing with you about Christians being online. And Fresh Expressions themselves have been in conversation with Disability and Jesus, an online group that has emerged amongst the community of people with disabilities. And that has been, we've been learning and hearing from them out of their long experience. But I do want to bring Ray in now. Just we're really pleased that you're back online with us, Ray. And I was saying when you disappeared that I'm really keen to hear some of your perspectives on Missio Dei in a digital age. In your chapter, you write about how in the Philippines, there's a sense of the possibility of democratizing theology, of everyone being a theologian in the because of the digital space. So let me quickly introduce you, then hand over to you for a bit to share some of your thoughts, Ray, while we've got you here, and hopefully you'll join us for the rest of the conversation. But just Ray is a Theological Education Network Coordinator for East and Southeast Asia for Tearfund UK. In the Philippines, he serves in the faculty of the Asian Seminary of Christian Ministries and as the advocacy coordinator for Integral Mission of MICA Philippines. Also a local author with several books in the vernacular published by OMF Literature, including one which I won't read in Filipino, but is the English translation of the title is Your Bible Boring? Which won the Filipino Readers' Choice Award. So well done on that, Ray. And do introduce yourself and share some of your thoughts briefly on from your perspective. Be great to hear.
Yeah. Thank you. I hope my connection will get stronger by the minute. But I would just like to share that, again, there was a new set of data released globally on how each country is performing in terms of their social media engagement. And again, the Philippines ranked as among the top social media users with an average of around, I think, close to 5 hours a day. And we were way out there among the most heavy social users. And as Jonas was explaining a while ago, that digital technology, social media, aside from becoming a tool or being used as a tool to do ministry, it has altered in so many ways the way we live our lives. And for many churches, the way churches also live their lives. And a lot of churches have gone online to Zoom. But aside from that utilization of technology, what I'm more interested is how even the conversations about spirituality and faith has also changed and has now included reflections and questions on what is this new technology adding or contributing to how we understand our faith, to how we live our spirituality, and all of those questions coming from the people of God themselves, from local members who are sitting on their screen every week, every Sunday, engaging with what remains of their churches online. It opens up fresh theological questions that would be of interest, of course, to theologians who are thinking along the lines of digital theology. But also it pulls other people who have an expertise in this particular technology to also contribute into that reflection. So that widens the conversation to include normal people who are nevertheless reflecting on their faith, and it would be an interesting space wherein the theologians, who are not all of them are very much well versed in technology, will get some benefit and learning into a dialogue with ordinary people who are more immersed into the digital environment, and perhaps together they will be able to find the answers to the questions that the shift to online engagement, online activities, online spirituality of the church has brought to the forefront, especially in the past months due to the pandemic. And I think it is that wide participation in terms of theological reflection that will pump the fresh blood into what Jonas was also explaining a while ago as a contextualization of theology, because now you pull into the conversation normal people, and you bring the theologizing activity into the, I couldn't say halls anymore, into the screens of the people of God who are actively practicing their faith online, and not a few theologians who are working along the lines of constructing local theology, and also the theologians who are working along the lines of post-colonial theology and decolonial theology is saying that a very important element for local theologies to actually bloom and thrive is for that theological activity to be embraced by the people of God, and not just the professional theologians who are in the schools, in the seminaries. And I think it is with this now the broadened conversation with the people of God and their everyday experience with technology and how it is shaping the way we do spirituality, the way we do ministry, will be going to carry forward a much more textured reflections on the Missio Dei.
Brilliant, Ray. I think in your chapter you talk about these two, so local theology in an age of global technology is, I think, the title of your chapter, and these two sort of almost opposing forces of globalization, and yet because of that globalization, because of the digital technologies, we're able to hear. I mean, this is just an example of that. We're able to hear voices from across the globe in this digital space, and that opportunity to hear yourself as a Filipino theologian, whereas some of the people engaging on Facebook may not have encountered those views before. So that the globalization offers a threat of standardization, of colonization of particular views, but you're saying actually it also creates the opportunity for voices, more diverse voices, to be heard in the theological space. I don't know if Katherine and Jonas want to engage in that, or Ray, you want to come back on what I've just said.
Well, I just wanted to point out how. Sorry, Ray, go ahead. Oh no, he's off again. So I just wanted to point out how important and maybe, I don't know if controversial is the right word, but how kind of in the heat of things, what Ray is saying is, because, I think that those of us who are, sort of interdisciplinary by nature, I know for me anyway, I have heard the critique from people not within theology that there is something inherently colonial or colonizing about mission itself, right? And so and perhaps this is why I have avoided, in some sense, missiology as a subfield of theology, because I have been worried about that, right? So the idea of mission itself, and perhaps we can get into that a little bit, but this idea of recognizing and hearing what Ray is saying from the perspective of folks who have appropriated or who have taken digital theology and our digital platforms, and have made it their own in terms of really localizing theology, right? Being able to have more voices in the conversation. And this is one of the, I think, values of the Global Network for Digital Theology, is that we're trying to think through where theology happens that is maybe a little bit more expansive than just the traditional academic setting. And perhaps it's sort of our temperament as digital theologians that we recognize the value in social media and other digital platforms for allowing multiple voices to enter the conversation as real, important, and sort of graced theological sites.
Ray, you were going to say something. Thank you for that, Katherine.
Yeah, maybe what I would like to add to what Katherine said is that it is true that digital technology has actually aided, and if it comes side by side with globalization, it has accelerated the influx of theological resources. And that's, of course, a concern for those doing post-colonial, colonial theology, because there's no way of stopping just the resources from the West to pour into the Global South. But at the same time, what gives me hope is that it is true that in today's digital environment, everyone can say something like, I mean, you can set up your YouTube channel, you can have your own the digital platform to say a piece of your mind, but not everyone will have a voice. And in this environment, those with resources to be would have more chances of having their voices heard. But what digital technology, I think, offers to those constructing local theology is for them to be able to explore a collective voice, to be able to come together, aided by technology, across the continent. I mean, local theologians in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, to come together. And if they come together, if they have a collective voice, that is a more stronger voice. And I have seen that happen. Like, for example, the Asia Theological Association, which is the local accrediting now body in Asia, it has 300 seminaries within its fold. And imagine 300 theologians, the voices of 300 theologians. We will never see the names. We may never see, maybe as prominent in the bookshelves. But if they come together with a collective voice and speak on something about issues that matters to them, that is a force to reckon with. And how will that be now possible? And I think it is that platform of connectivity, as Jonas was saying, the network idea of the digital environment that can facilitate those conversations and those gathering together of voices from different contexts and places and contribute to the global conversation of theology and also of how to do ministry in today's age.
Yeah, I mean that's really one of the great advantages of this technology is that it furthers this idea of the church universal. Right now we can have a global church and we can engage on the global level in a way that's much easier than before. But I think we still have to be intentional about it, right? So yes, we now have the platforms to do this kind of global theologizing that's very enriching, and that that can help us grow as a church universal. But we still need to invite those voices to be heard on our platforms and even our digital platforms. So the infrastructure is there, but this needs to be an intentional act.
Yeah, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Jonas, but I'm certainly aware of theological institutions realizing the poverty of their libraries, the reading lists, and actually seeking out alternative voices for students who are being formed for ministry or theological students to engage with. And I think that intentionality is there in some places, and which is encouraging. But actually, we now have that access. We now have access to some of those voices we might not otherwise have heard.
I think though we, and again, perhaps this is sort of my confessional problem, but I think there is a tension here though about figuring out boundaries, right? So there's clearly, like you said, a deep poverty in a lot of academic theological institutions, I think, in, let's say, Europe and the UK and, the United States. But, for me, I'm also concerned about, from my own context, not only as the Catholic context, but from an American context, our political situation. I think you see this in other places as well, the way in which theology has been co-opted by particular ideologies because it's so democratic, right? So now you can have a radical, and usually I think that word is positive, but let's say like a far right pastor who adopts a Twitter following or has a Twitter following of a lot of people and is able to actually, abuse, I think, theological categories for political ends or something like that. So on the one hand, I'm very, of course, optimistic about the ways in which digital platforms allow multiple voices. But the reason why I mentioned, and I appreciate what Jonas was saying about, sort of the institutional speed or lack thereof with which, church communities have come online. But part of the problem with that, part of why I want to highlight that, is because there's this tension between allowing as many voices in the conversation as possible, while at the same time having some semblance of, dare I say, orthodoxy, right? Or sort of ecclesial boundary or something like that. And I know I'm sounding maybe a little trad, but you see what I'm saying. I do think that there's this kind of tension or something that we have to wrestle with in terms of how do we keep a sense of doctrine in a kind of democratizing theological landscape.
And if it was a pure democracy, rather than being governed by algorithms on social media, which amplify particular types of voices, that's another issue, isn't it? That it's not necessarily a pure democracy, that the voices are each heard equally. I don't know if anyone's got anything else to say on that. There's a couple of questions about community online, and I'm trying to so let me just put this question up from Lawrence. Getting online is the first step. Well, the next steps for a church to create a sense of community, to transform an online user to an online parishioner. And I think there's some questions there. I wrote down a quote, and I'm not sure which one of you said this, but basically was referring to an incarnational gospel cannot be prepackaged and mass marketed. That we are talking about how do people in the digital space understand an incarnational gospel? And I guess that comes to some of what you're saying in your enculturation chapter, Katherine. I don't know if you've got thoughts on what that you did say earlier on about sort of perhaps fleshing out some of what enculturation of the online space looks like.
Yeah, so for at this moment, and again, we're sort of wrestling with the general category of culture, but also enculturation. In my chapter, I mentioned, and I don't mention this, I don't think clearly enough, but in his own work on enculturation, Pope John Paul II says, now I sound really trad, right? Understanding, appreciating, fostering, and evangelizing. He's talking about sort of the perspective of the missionary. So I'm going to say that again. So understanding, appreciating, fostering, and evangelizing. And he uses, I'm going to assume for my own purposes that that's the order that you're supposed to do it. And what I'm intrigued by is that evangelizing comes last. And perhaps evangelizing is the whole project, but I love that he starts with understanding, right? So I encourage in my chapter, I give sort of some specific proposals. I encourage lurking. I encourage people who are within church leadership, especially pastors, ministers, to do some real, like, just, maybe not even so active listening, but some real, like, sort of lurking online to get a sense of themes that come up, concerns that come up for people. And so I think that that's sort of the first step, is kind of just like allowing yourself to be immersed in an online context. And that's why this notion of culture really speaks to me, because I do think that for people who have not spent most of their life online, which is still a lot of us, right? It is a whole culture to learn, in the sense that it has languages and symbolic forms you need to understand. And so those are, I like that kind of 4-step process, and the notion that it's a process, right? So a kind of process that is intentional for a group of people, but also that it's probably a spiritual process, that it probably is a process of acting, and then also like self-reflection, right? Spiritual self-reflection through prayer and in a community and things like that. So there's just some thoughts as to why I'm so taken by the notion of enculturation from John Paul II, but I'm also putting a lot on those 4 categories, So yeah, that's just a couple of things that come to mind.
Jonas,
can I add something
Ray?
very quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Jonas was explaining a while ago about how it is very important for us to understand if we want to engage in the digital environment, that the digital environment is not flat. I mean, there are specifics to every technological platform you're going to use. And for example, social media. So the question of how do you engage users? I mean, understanding the context of social media, it is a medium of interaction and participation. It is not a medium that you use like a broadcast media wherein people will just watch. And understanding the nature of the media hopefully will have you thinking about, so how do you engage people online aside from just watching and clicking, and how it happens that their engagement online seamlessly waves with what they do when they are no longer in their phones, which is basically how social media has structured a lot of experiences or sets of other people. Just a very quick example, like in the Philippines, we have this cultural value of bayanihan. In the olden days, you will have, and you can look it up in Google. You could find people carrying houses, the entire neighborhood coming together to carry houses and move it to another place. I mean, those nipahat. And how do you translate that? We call it the bayanihan. And if that transforms into an online experience, a digital bayanihan, aside from the online engagement, so how do you leverage connectivity online into something tangible that people can do together when they are no longer in their phones? So it's a digitally enabled mobilization of the community. I mean, that integration of offline and online, I think, is one thing that has to be considered when we're trying to design this ministry and spirituality in the digital sphere.
I guess we've got to recognize that the online and offline is increasingly being merged, right? So they are less and less separate aspects of our life. They kind of flow in together. And so one example of that would be, you're talking about community building. Well, a lot of the community we have online, we also meet offline, right? So one example would be, some of you might have joined these neighborhood platforms where people in the local area share information. They might be that they want a I don't know, a plumber or something, and they're asking for recommendations. But there's also the sense of mutual support, especially during the COVID lockdown that's been. I really need to do someone to shop for me. Can someone going to shop today? Can you pick this up? So it's kind of this kind of a good example of how the two merge together, and where actually technology is helping building even local community, let alone global community. I guess that maybe we want to return a little bit back to the question that was asked, which I think was about how do we build online communities, or what does that look like? Well, it looks very differently, I think, for different people, and I think what we have to think about is really, what is community? How do you qualify and quantify what is community? There's something emotive about community. It's about connection, the level of connection, maybe belonging, intimacy. Those are all kind of things that are very difficult to measure, in tick boxes. So maybe it's talking to people that have online community, and there it does seem like people, do feel a deep sense of connection through online communication. It's different from offline community building. I think it should be true that actually most of us would have preferred to meet our loved ones face to face, offline. But we can still build strong relationship with friends and family through online communication, and that are real and true and healthy, and are encouraging us, and all those kind of things that you'd want from any community. So it's still possible. It just the way you communicate and how you do it might have to change slightly. So I've been part of a home group during this during lockdown, and I only joined a week before lockdown happened. So I've only met these people on Zoom, although they're local, and it's just taken longer to get to know people individually, because it's harder to ask, so what do you do, Katherine, when there's another 10 people in in the Zoom meeting? So you've got to find ways of doing that, but there's different technology that allows you to do that as well. So it's partly finding the technology for what kind of community you want to build.
I think also we can learn a lot from sociologists here. When we think about community, we have to be okay with what they would call weak ties, that we can't expect that we're going to be intimate friends with everybody. And we don't expect that from I don't think we expect that from our church communities. I don't think we should. It's just not possible, right? So to Lawrence's question, it's really about trying to foster the relationality that we were mentioning, but realizing that it has to be it's okay if we just have weak ties to a lot of the members of the community. I think it's really more about what one of the scholars in my chapter calls a shared imagination. How do you foster a shared imagination among people who are diffuse, right? And it's just that it's not that offline community is not diffuse and online community is diffuse. It's that it's just different means of diffusion, and being honest about what we can and can't do in community. I have been frustrated in my own work with a kind of valorization of offline church community that has sort of told these myths about how close we all are, in parishes or congregations or communities. It's like, no, we're not all best friends, but that's normal. Like, that's okay, but it does take, there's a middle ground between sort of knowing no one at your church and feeling like a visitor, and then wanting to be best friends with everybody. There's really this kind of middle ground that can be facilitated. And I think that social media is not an impediment to that if you are honest and realistic about what can actually occur between people online.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that Katherine's making last there, is that we tend to idolize offline community, but they don't live up to the ideals that we set.
Yeah.
Right? So why are we measuring online with offline when offline is far from probably what most of us would call ideal?
Yeah. And we're not alone in this, by the way. This is not just church people that do this. We do this with education. We do this with academics. I mean, we do it with everything, that when we want to basically demonize or be, I would say, overly critical of technology, we tend to say, well, it's not as good as the offline version. I'm not sure.
My hope is that myth has been dispelled as people have been forced onto the online space and have realized that they can do relationship and community in that space in as deep or even deeper in some cases a way as they can in a physical space. I think we've got time for just one more sort of question, although actually before I put that up, I just want to make people aware of this. I'm going to put a link in the comments in a moment. The book that we are talking to the authors of chapters from is available with a 20% off discount code. Yeah, there you go. Brilliant. Thank you, Katherine. Missio 21. And if you enter that at the online checkout on the link I'm going to just put in the comments, then you will be able to buy the book with a 20% discount. So we'll just come to the last question. I'll put that up in a second. so which was, again, I guess, just share an anecdote from this weekend. I saw someone post on Facebook basically saying that shared they've been sharing on Facebook stuff that their church is doing, or evangelistic texts, for a while in a secular group, a community group, and they haven't had problems. But this weekend they had a problem with someone objecting to the fact that they were posting these things in this Facebook group, and they were sort of asking for advice from other ministers how they should respond to that. And I noticed in your introduction to the book, Jonas, you talked about people's discovery that unlike mass media, social media is not unidirectional. You know, the church is talked back at by the people that you might otherwise have given a book to, or sent a tract to, or what have you. Do you want to just sort of think about that? I mean, so just looking for the question, someone said that they were anxious that we would just take the normal ways of doing church online. It would be another we don't embrace what social media is, or what the digital space provides in terms of community and conversation, rather just see it another form of mass media.
Yeah, I think that's a conversation that we need to have now. Is, you know, I think early on, especially when I'm observing how churches went about online worship, it was basically a broadcast. Most churches broadcast. It was a broadcasted service. But I think, you know, some churches are learning that, you know, we can encourage people to participate through, especially comments field. That would be the most obvious way of doing that. But also you can move around to different people's homes as well. You can have different readings. But it partly depends on your liturgical and ecclesial background, I think, how much you want to do that. But underlying that is the question of control and authority. Right? You know, like, who is in charge here? And so you can use digital technology for broadcasting if you want. I mean, you can even be on social media, and you can not allow, you know, you can ignore people, or you can, I mean, it's in some cases, like, I'm sure, you know, some of the church, the heads of churches, you know, they're not even doing their own social media feed. You know, they've got a team around them doing that for them. But yeah, I think it does. At least digital technology does allow for interaction and participation. And, you know, this is one of the things that even more traditional liturgical scholars would talk about, is the importance of exactly that, of participation. And here we got an opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
Just to Adam's comment, you know, this for me is precisely why this is a theological question, because if you truly believe that this is a living God who moves and acts within history, then of course we're going to have to always be reflecting on what the church looks like in its particular place and time. And I'm heartened by studying church history, because you see that this is a perennial question, right? How do we deal with whatever the cultural context is? That is not to say that the question about, like, what technology is not important, right? Because, like I said, we have to figure out how to understand this thing we're calling technology or digitality or what have you. But for me, it's a question of nature and grace. It's a question of, you know, the human and the divine. So I think someone mentioned, you know, what's the incarnational question here? This is precisely at the heart of it, you know, because trying to understand what the church is in the world, I think is the main question. You know, how do we live eschatologically? How do we live in the already but not yet, you know? And so I think this is sort of my strongest argument for why digital theology is properly theology, you know, and we've had to fight that fight. And I think that we're sort of coming to the end of it, I hope. But I think that comment specifically, you can see why this is a theological conversation, and not just a sociological conversation. It really is about how we understand God acting in the world.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about, and the context is so important. You look at Jesus, and he sat at the side of tables, eating and talking in conversation. He sat or stood on hillsides and in boats preaching, and understanding the digital space. Is it a pulpit or is it a dinner party? And you will relate in a godly way, in a polite way, differently in those contexts. It's right to preach when you're in a pulpit. It's not right to preach when you're standing or sitting at a table with friends. And understanding the space, I think, is key. And I think the theological thinking in the book helps us to sort of grapple with what is this space, and what does a godly presence, a Christian presence, an incarnational presence mean in that space. We've reached the top of the hour, as they say, and we'll draw this conversation to a close. But I'm just going to give an opportunity for each of you just to share any final thoughts that you might have, questions or challenges that you want to leave those who are engaging with this to chew on, or just a final few words. Oh, and Ray's gone. Hopefully he'll be back.
I don't know. I mean, I guess I would close with something that's sort of been my my pulpit for the past 6 months or so, and that would be a renewed call for digital literacy across the church. From my sort of institutional confessional perspective, I would like to see all seminaries include in their curriculum basic digital literacy. And I think that digital literacy done properly will address some of the concerns I raised before about, having people in positions of power, be they clerical or lay, having them, with a better understanding of what the relationship is to, or what the church's relationship is to digital culture, in a way that's informed not only by theology, but also by the tools of digital literacy and new media. So that would sort of be my closing call proposal.
Great. Ray, any final thoughts from you? Oh, I don't know if Ray can hear us. Just wondering if you've got any final thoughts, Ray, to share before we close.
Very reluctant to yes, I was. I hope you can hear me. I was saying that for us that it forced the church to consider a new frontier of missions and ministry, and I think the Spirit of God who has opened this space to take spirituality and community online, and I think that is not just a new arena to engage in, but it also gives the church a fresh opportunity and chance to reimagine itself in a new way. You see, my church, been meeting over Zoom for the past months since March, and there are realizations that we have reached that there are a lot of things that we do together online that we will not be able to do offline. And so we are seriously considering that this space will continue, and this engagement as well, which has also grown into a global engagement of all our members scattered all over the world who can join us. And I think this is a moment that the Spirit of God is giving for the church to reimagine itself. So I hope churches would listen and hear what the Spirit of God is saying as it takes it into a new space of engagement.
Brilliant, Ray. I love your optimism and your ability to see opportunities in this season for the church. Jonas, I'm going to come to you finally. Just in terms of what Katherine said, I know that you're a program director for MA in digital theology at Spurgeon's College, which is where I train. So I'm really pleased that Spurgeon's is embracing digital theology within its preparation for ministers. Now, that's not an undergraduate course at this point, so it's not fulfilling Katherine's request that every minister be formed in that way, but it's a good step forward. Any final thoughts from you as we bring this conversation to a close?
I thought that Ray's comments were great, so I almost feel a bit bad to not let him end this conversation. I think my final reflection would be that kind of the visibility of Christian faith that the online offers or digital offers. At least in British society and many European society, religion has been relegated to private, and that opportunity for just lived religion, lived Christianity, just to be seen by just Christians living their lives online.
Yeah. I was just pointing out. Thank you for that, Jonas. I was just putting the group up, Katherine. If you search for the Global Network on Facebook, there is a group that you can join there. Thank you for pointing that out, Katherine. Brilliant. Thank you to Jonas, to Katherine, to Ray. Just a reminder, this was just the first of 3 conversations. So over the next couple of weeks, we've got some more with different contributors to the book Missio Dei in a Digital Age. And don't forget to, if you haven't got a copy of the book yet, that you can use the link in the comments. Right on cue, and get a 20% discount off, and we're grateful to the publishers for making that discount available. So thank you everybody for being part of the conversation. Thank you to our 3 speakers, authors in that book, and we'll catch you again sometime soon. Bless you. Bye-bye.